to check their onslaught when they charge." Although Jethro held no position entitling him to command, his orders were as promptly obeyed as if he had been in authority. The men recognized at once, by the calmness of his tones, that he was accustomed to warfare, and readily yielded to him obedience. In a minute or two a crowd of figures could be seen approaching, and the Egyptians, leaping to their feet, poured in a volley of arrows. The yells and screams which broke forth testified to the execution wrought in the ranks of the enemy, but without a check they still rushed forward. The Egyptians discharged their arrows as fast as they could during the few moments left them, and then, as the natives rushed at the breastwork, they threw down their bows, and grasping the spears, maces, swords, axes, or staves with which they were armed, boldly met the foe. For a few minutes the contest was doubtful, but encouraged by the shouts of Jethro, whose voice could be heard above the yells of the natives, the Egyptians defended their position with vigor and courage. As fast as the natives climbed over the low breastwork of merchandise they were either speared or cut down, and after 10 minutes' fierce fighting their attack ceased as suddenly as it had begun, and as if by magic a dead silence succeeded the din of battle. "You have done well, comrades," Jethro said, "and defeated our assailants; but we had best stand to arms for a while, for they may return. I do not think they will, for they have found us stronger and better prepared for them than they had expected. Still, as we do not know their ways, it were best to remain on our guard." An hour later, as nothing had been heard of the enemy, the fires were relighted and the wounded attended to. 16 men had been shot dead by the arrows of the assailants, and some 50 were more or less severely wounded by the same missiles, while 18 had fallen in the hand-to-hand contest at the breastwork. 37 natives were found dead inside the breastwork. How many had fallen before the arrows of the defenders the latter never knew, for it was found in the morning that the natives had carried off their killed and wounded who fell outside the inclosure. As soon as the fighting was over Chebron ran down to the boat to allay the fears of the girls and assure them that none of their party had received a serious wound, Jethro alone having been hurt by a spear thrust, which, however, glanced off his ribs, inflicting only a flesh wound, which he treated as of no consequence whatever.
"Why did not Amuba come down with you?" Mysa asked. "Are you sure that he escaped without injury?" "I can assure you that he has not been touched, Mysa, but we are still on guard. For it is possible that the enemy may return again, although we hope that the lesson has been sufficient for them." "Were you frightened, Chebron?"
"I felt a little nervous as they were coming on, but when it came to hand fighting I was too excited to think anything about the danger. Besides, I was standing between Jethro and Amuba, and they have fought in great battles, and seemed so quiet and cool that I could scarcely feel otherwise. Jethro took the command of everyone, and the rest obeyed him without question. But now I must go back to my post. Jethro told me to slip away to tell you that we were all safe, but I should not like not to be in my place if they attack again."
"I have often wondered, Ruth," Mysa said when Chebron had left them, "what we should have done if it had not been for Jethro and Amuba. If it had not been for them I should have been obliged to marry Plexo, and Chebron would have been caught and killed at Thebes. They arrange everything, and do not seem afraid in the slightest." "I think your brother is brave too," Ruth said, "and they always consult with him about their plans." "Yes, but it is all their doing," Mysa replied. "Chebron, before they came, thought of nothing but reading, and was gentle and quiet. I heard one of the slaves say to another that he was more like a girl than a boy. But being with Amuba has quite altered him. Of course he is not as strong as Amuba, but he can walk and run and shoot an arrow and shoot a javelin at a mark almost as well as Amuba can. Still he has not so much spirit. I think Amuba always speaks decidedly, while Chebron hesitates to give an opinion." "But your brother has a great deal more learning than Amuba, and so his opinion ought to be worth more, Mysa." "Oh, yes, if it were about history or science. For anything of that sort of course it would, Ruth. But not about other things. Of course it is natural that they should be different, because Amuba is the son of a king." "The son of a king!" Ruth repeated in surprise. "Yes, I heard it when he first came, only father said it was not to be mentioned, because if it were known he would be taken away from us and kept as a royal slave at the palace. But he is really the son of a king, and as his father is dead he will be king himself when he gets back to his own country." "And Jethro is one of the same people, is he not?" Ruth asked. "Oh, yes, they are both Rebu. I think Jethro was one of the king's warriors." "That accounts," Ruth said, "for what has often puzzled me. Jethro is much the oldest of our party, and altogether the leader, and yet I have observed that he always speaks to Amuba as if the latter were the chief." "I have not noticed that," Mysa said, shaking her head; "but I do know, now that you mention it, that he always asked Amuba's opinion before giving his own." "I have constantly noticed it, Mysa, and I wondered that since he and Amuba were your father's slaves he should always consult Amuba instead of your brother; but I understand now. That accounts too for Amuba giving his opinion so decidedly. Of course in his own country Amuba was accustomed to have his own way. I am glad of that, for I like Amuba very much, and it vexed me sometimes to see him settling things when Jethro is so much older. And you think if he ever gets back to his own country he will be king?" "I am not sure," Mysa said doubtfully. "Of course he ought to be. I suppose there is some other king now, and he might not like to give up to Amuba." "I don't suppose we shall ever get there," Ruth said. "Amuba said the other day that this country lay a great distance further than the land of my people came from a long time ago." "But that is not so very far, Ruth. You said that the caravans went in 6 or 7 days from that part of Egypt where you dwelt to the east of the Great Sea where your fathers came from. But we are a long way from there, Mysa. But if it is only 6 or 7 days' journey, why did not your people go back again, Ruth?" "They always hoped to go back some day, Mysa, but I don't think your people would have let them go. You see, they made them useful for building and cutting canals and other work. Besides, other people dwell now in the land they came from, and these would not turn out unless they were beaten in battle. My people are not accustomed to fight; besides, they have stopped so long that they have become as the Egyptians. For the most part they talk your language, although some have also preserved the knowledge of their own tongue. They worship your gods, and if they were not forced to labor against their will, I think now that most of them would prefer to live in ease and plenty in Egypt rather than journey into a strange country, of which they know nothing except that their forefathers hundreds of years ago came thence. But here are the others," she broke off as the boat heeled suddenly over as some one sprang on board. "Now we shall hear more about the fighting." The next day the journey was continued, and without further adventure the flotilla arrived at last at the town where the party would leave the river and strike for the coast. Having unloaded their goods and discharged the boat, Jethro hired a small house until arrangements were made for their journey to the seacoast. El Makrif was a place of no great importance. A certain amount of trade was carried on with the coast, but most of the merchants trading with Meroe preferred the longer but safer route through Axoum. Still parties of travelers passed up and down and took boat there for Meroe, but there was an absence of the temples and great buildings which had distinguished every town they had passed between Thebes and Semneh. Jethro upon inquiry found that there were wells at the camping places along the whole route. The people were wild and savage, the Egyptian power extending only from the seashore to the foot of the hills, some 15 miles away. Occasionally expeditions were got up to punish the tribesmen for their raids upon the cultivated land of the coast, but it was seldom that the troops should come upon them, for, knowing every foot of the mountains, these eluded all search by their heavy armed adversaries. Jethro found that the custom was for merchants traveling across this country to pay a fixed sum in goods for the right of passage. There were 2 chiefs claiming jurisdiction over the road, and a messenger was at once dispatched to the nearest of these with the offer of the usual payment and a request for an escort. A week later 4 wild looking figures presented themselves at the house and stated that they were ready to conduct the travelers through their chief's territory. Jethro had already made arrangements with the head man of the place to furnish him with 12 men to carry the provisions necessary for the journey, and upon the following morning the party started, and Mysa and Ruth assumed the garb of boys, Jethro finding that although traders might bring up the ladies of their family to Semneh, or even take them higher up the river in boats, they would never think of exposing them to the fatigue of a journey across the mountains, and that the arrival of 2 girls at the Egyptian town on the sea would therefore assuredly attract remark, and possibly inquiry, on the part of the authorities.
For the first few hours the girls enjoyed the change of traveling after the long confinement on the boat, but long before nightfall they longed for the snug cushions